Hi, my name is Mark Ackroyd, Head of Advice Delivery, Strategy and Innovation for Lumient, and welcome to another episode of Lumient Live, the podcast for advice professionals that believe in a values-based advice experience, but still have that question, how does it all work? The Lumient Live podcast connects listeners with other advice professionals to hear best practice client stories or business examples and lifts the lid on how they made that happen. Today, I'm lucky enough to be joined by David Haintz of Global Advisor Alpha. G'day, David. How are you?
Mark, hi. Good to be here. Good to see you.
Great to have you on board, mate. And for those that don't know David, he's got quite a long and impressive resume. So I'll give you the highlights now. David was a past director of the FPA and has had a 28-year career as a founding member of Shadforth, a quite well-known financial planning firm here in Australia. Shadforth, at the time he departed, was over 100 advisors, $13 billion in FUM, and $58 million EBIT. He's since established Global Advisor Alpha, a B2B consultancy with a passion for helping leading global advice businesses become world-class and achieve outstanding results for all stakeholders. And in his spare time, he even penned his own book, The Life First Advisor, How the New Financial Coach Connects Money with Meaning. David, that's quite an impressive resume, and we're really excited to have you on board to talk about values-based advice experiences today. Why don't we start with you telling me a little bit about how you've seen values-based advice shape over the last few years and why you believe it works?
Yeah, well, I think there's been a natural progression, Mark. If you think about where financial advice came from, 20, 30, 40 years ago, there were accountants, there were lawyers, there were insurance brokers. There was really no financial advice industry, and it's evolved over that time, obviously, initially from an investment perspective, and then that direct equity side moved into, in Australia, managed funds. And that's really evolved over time now. If you look at in year 2000, 2% of money in the world was invested using some form of index fund or ETF. That's gone from 2% 20 years ago to closer to 50% today. So more and more people have got the data and the analytics saying, are we really adding value below the line? And so the advisors have had to evolve their propositions. And I think it's evolved in many ways. I talk about this imaginary line moving from below the line to above the line, moving from the product to the people, or from the money to the meaning. And so as we sit here, not only today, but the last 5-10 years, I think the more advanced advisors have been moving not only down the goals-based path, but I think those that are really at the pointy end have adopted a values-based approach and a goals-based approach. So I was lucky enough, being a studier of global best practice, spending a lot of money over the last 20 or 30 years in personal development. I learned from a UK mentor in 1995 about this, goals-based advice opportunity and put that into practice. I spent some money in the US in the late 90s, early 2000s, and learned about values-based advice. So putting values-based advice and goals-based advice together into my proposition from 95 with the goals-based advice, 2000 with values-based advice, really propelled me to individual success. You mentioned Shadforth. I mean, we had 120 advisors. I very proudly but humbly brought on more new clients, more new assets, and more revenue than any of those 120 advisors 5 years in a row. And the reason was because I was delivering what the consumer wants, and that is values-based and goals-based advice, above the line advice. So I think the advisors at the pointy end get that, and they've started to move their proposition down that path. But obviously there's a lot that haven't, and I'd be really encouraging them to have a good look at that.
Yeah, and what made you make the switch? You mentioned obviously global best practice, but you've still, as an advisor, got to make the mental call to go, you know what, I'm all in on something like this. What was the driver for you?
Well, I think that the driver for me was common sense. If you're giving somebody investment advice around direct shares or managed funds, of course, everybody would rather get a 10% return than an 8% return. But do they need a 10% return? Could they be taking less risk? You've got to get the investment piece in the context of the values and the goals. This is not a dress rehearsal for another life. It's the only one we've got. And so it just made such perfect common sense to me that there was more to money, and we needed to have that meaning around it. So I think common sense. And then when I started to have those conversations with real people, and the ultimate question you can ask as an advisor is why. If you're a financial advisor and you're sitting next to someone on a plane, and they say, "G'day, Mark, nice to meet you. What do you do?" Let's say I'm a financial advisor. The next question they're going to ask you is, what stock should I be buying? Is the market overheated? Or what do you think of crypto? I mean, most people think that financial advisors only offer below the line solutions, but the better advisors are obviously offering so much more than that. And so if I was that person next to you on the plane and I said, well, Mark, if you asked me, David, what do you do? And then you started asking me about crypto and market timing, etc. If my response to you was, well, sure, I can help you with all of that, Mark, but before I do, what is it you're trying to achieve and why are you trying to achieve that? And it moves that whole conversation from below the line to above the line, and it's incredibly powerful. And one of the learnings for me, 20 odd years ago was this notion of the family CFO and the non-CFO spouse. What psychologists would talk about left brain and right brain. And financial advisors for years have been targeting prospects and clients with left brain below the line offerings about money, dollars, cents, alpha, outperformance, et cetera, et cetera. And if you then start to throw in the question why, and you start to have the values-based conversation and the goals-based conversation, if it's a couple, the non-CFO spouse, which more than often is the female who is completely unengaged in the old traditional financial advice model, who wouldn't turn up to meetings in year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5 because it's boring as all hell, is completely engaged in the process. And when you start to run that lifelong cash flow model on the big screen in your boardroom, it's the non-CFO spouse that's up out of the chair, pointing at the screen, change this, change that, and moving 180 degrees from being completely unengaged and disinterested to totally engaged in the process. So common sense, a hypothesis that this was going to work, training from mentors and putting it into practice, and it worked. And I guess what I'd share with you, Mark, would be, I guess a couple of success stories, if I may.
Yeah, please.
I mean, firstly, on an individual level with, let's call them Peter and Julie, and their names happen to be Peter and Julie. But, we developed an agenda. We're talking about scalable advice businesses. And so I believe that there's no point in anybody having original thought in a routine situation. So I learned to develop a hard copy agenda for discovery meetings. And the pecking order of that hard copy agenda was, broadly, number 1, values, number 2, goals, and number 3, all of the financial hygiene. So we're not leading with how much money have you got in super and what's your house worth. We're leading with what's important about money to you and your values. We're then getting onto your goals and your aspirations. And so I'm in a prospect meeting with let's call them Peter and Julie. Peter and Julie are running a super successful Melbourne-based business. They're a mid-30s couple, $4 million a year EBIT in this business. And I asked the question, what's important about money to you? And that number 1 question in the first 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes of the discovery meeting. And there was crickets, absolute silence. And I said, look, there's no hurry. There's no right or wrong answer. Take your time. But again, I understand you might not have been asked this question before, but I'm really interested to know what's important about money to you. And after another pause, and Peter, he didn't exactly start crying, but he started to well up. I mean, here's a 35-year-old guy making $4 million a year. And we're probably 2 or 3 minutes into the question, lots of pauses, lots of silence, take your time. And he said, David, I raised my kids on a dairy farm in Gippsland, riding motorbikes, chasing cows, kicking the footies. And I've just realised that here I am in the big smoke making all this money, and I've got 2 young kids, and I had the world's best upbringing, and I would love to bring my kids up the same way I was raised. Well, fast forward 5 years later, he gave me a call and said, David, thanks for that conversation we had 5 years ago. I've sold the business, I've cashed in, I've bought a farm, and we're taking the kids down there. So there's the power of that values-based conversation. I'm not asking them what your goals and your aspirations are. I'm saying what's important about money to you, and it can have a profound impact on people's lives. And so when we started to teach that at Shadforth, I'll let you fire another question at me. But when we started to develop that structure at Shadforth, we got some pretty profound outcomes, which I'll share with you shortly.
That's brilliant. Maybe one question on the Peter and Julie scenario, and sometimes we hear this from the advisors we work with, because it can be a little bit awkward, is that there's a common perception, maybe in the industry, or maybe it could be Australian perception, that the more money I have, the less likely I am to dig into the soft and fuzzy and get into the emotion, because, I wouldn't have all that money if I wanted to talk about goals and values. I just need you to invest it. That's what I'm here for. As an advisor, you clearly took a different approach. In your experience, does having that amount of money change that conversation, or it seemed like you're still getting into, in inverted commas, for those that are listening on the audio, you won't see me doing the rabbit ears, but that they don't want to get into the soft and fuzzy, or is it just you've got to get in there and hold space?
Well, I suspect there's an assumption that the more money people have, the happier they are. I can tell you a real story from someone I know incredibly well who has a family worth of $1.5 million. And they have some family challenges that they work through, and they brought in a very well-known Australian coach to help them through some of those issues. And the question was asked of the coach, do you get many other families with net worths above $1 billion, $2 billion, $5 billion that have issues and are unhappy? And he said his response was incredibly profound. He said, you go and grab for me the BRW top 200 wealthy families in the country, and I'll show you the 200 unhappiest families in the country. And so, there's a real life example where a person who coaches and mentors some of the richest families in Australia is saying that more than often they've got some of the biggest issues and aren't particularly happy.
Yeah, absolutely. We've just got to get in there and ask that question. What's important to you, and as you've experienced and explained, it's often not a question they get asked, and I think advisors have to play that role, right?
Yeah, and for me, whether it's advisors changing anything, whether it's their pricing models, their value proposition, their investment philosophy, 99.9 times out of 100, it's the advisor that's got the issue. It's the advisor that's the bottleneck, not the client. So in this particular case, for the advisors listening in that are delivering, respectfully, an old co value proposition below the line, I'm saying, open your minds, give it some thought, take some coaching from, people like yourself and others. And I can assure you there's significant evidence that it works.
And let's talk about some of that evidence, because obviously at Shadforth, you played the role of an advisor, but you were, an interested business owner as well. So you had to play, as many of our advisors do, the business owner hat and the advisor hat. From a business owner perspective, you were alluding to the fact you've got some good examples and some reflections on how implementing values-based advice worked for you as a business. Can you share some of that as well, and what your reflections were?
So, from an individual success perspective, it was only down to me being a student of global best practice advice and putting my hand in my pocket, jumping on planes, getting mentors, doing programs. And so I put what I learned into practice for, significant outcomes for me personally as an advisor. And so, having brought in, significant clients, significant revenue, significant assets in those first 5 years as an advisor at Shadforth, what I witnessed as a frustrated business owner, I wasn't the only owner, but one of the owners, was that of 120 advisors, the average conversion rate of those 120 advisors was 25%, 1 in 4. So for every 4 new prospects that came in at Shadforth in that first 5 years, only 1 went ahead with advice. Now, there's no perfect ratio, but I would have thought somewhere in the order of 70 to 90% would be around about the conversion rate you should be shooting for. So Shadforth's hitting 25%. And so you can start to unpack, well, why is that? Clearly it's got to be because we're not offering and delivering a value proposition that they're looking for. And my experience was it was a below the line, product-based, investment-based proposition. And so having put my hand in my pocket and go on looking for global best practice and had some individual successes using that structure, the logical thing as a co-business owner was to say, hey, 1 in 4, 25% is disastrous. Why don't we put some structure in place? And so the structure and the coaching was changing the CVP from below the line to above the line, getting some structure around what the meetings look like, what the objectives are of each of those meetings, what the agendas are, actually having a formal hard copy agenda, what questions to ask and in what order. I mentioned a bit earlier to start with values first, play your trump card first, values. Your second card is your goals and aspirations, and all of that, financial hygiene that we would typically lead with in an old co experience comes third after values and goals. And so in putting that in place with the Shadforth, and it's not a 1 day, 2 day, it's a training program that takes some time. But having walked the advisors around Australia through that program, in 12 months, we're able to take the conversions from 25% to 67%, and the number of new clients, the average number of new clients the advisors brought on doubled, on double the revenue and double the FUM. So, it wasn't life-changing, but to move from a low ratio to getting more towards where any firm needs to be was really just around common sense, new CVP, structure, and it's fine if you're a 1 or 2 person show in running a small practice or a small business, but when you're running 20 offices and 120 advisors, you've got to have some system and process around that, and you don't want any of your team to be having original thought in a routine situation. So at scale, you've got to have global best practice process, and that's not to say that whatever process we had in place in 2011 should be in place in 2021. You've got to evolve with what global best practice looks like, but there can only be one best way of doing things. And so let's go and seek out what that looks like, and let's do it. And so the evidence from that best practice approach was that significant shift from 1 in 4 to 67% outcome.
So amazing outcomes. And probably one of my final questions is, a lot of our practices now are growing exponentially. They're either growing organically or inorganically through acquisition, and therefore getting more and more advisors on, and are starting to reach that point where they're realizing to get scale, they've got to get consistent processes. And as you alluded to, you did it at 120 advisor scale. It's hard work. It's really hard work. What are your reflections on that change management process, or how you achieved that scale of the experience when you were at Shadforth that you might want to share there? Is there anything you might do differently or you think about still?
Well, I think so. Firstly, go looking for what that global best practice is. There's a difference between being leading edge and bleeding edge. You want to be where the market is, or just in front of where the market is from a value proposition, and not 10 or 20 or 30 years in front of where the industry is. So certainly developing an above the line philosophy, values and goals-based advice. To do that at scale today, 2022 and beyond, you really need some tech to be supporting that. So we had tech in the sense of what I would call lifelong cash flow modelling, which was that modelling tool to enable you to look at the trade-offs. More of one thing means less of something else. So, using a Sydney example, let's say I could afford to retire at 77 years of age and buy a house in Double Bay. Well, maybe I might want to retire at 58 and buy a house in country New South Wales. There's no right or wrong answer, but you need a tool to be able to model it out. So the technology around the modelling of that. But I think, I've been looking for a long time to find technology around the values-based piece. The values-based piece that I learnt, that I taught at Shadforth was, sure, the question was on the agenda, but it was a verbal question and there was no tech that we could really capture the responses and the answers, that if an advisor retired or left the firm, we could pass on what was important about money to that client, to the next advisor. And so tech would be the logical response, where everything that we've just discussed today, Mark, around values-based advice and goals-based advice and the hygiene can all be captured on a tech stack to enable some serious scalability. And that's why I went out looking for global best practice. That's why I found Lumient. That's why I'm an ambassador for what Lumient's doing, because I'm incredibly passionate about changing the world of advice, one advisor at a time. This is not something that is nuanced just to Australia. Australia just happens to be, in my opinion, having worked in 20 different markets over the last 7 years, perhaps we're not the leading market in the world, but we are right up there as far as value proposition. But we've got to take the next step, and the next step's going to require a tech stack to enable the values and the goals-based advice in conjunction with all of the other financial advice we deliver to be able to do that at scale. So I certainly believe that the average advice practice is going to become a business, whether it's through organic or inorganic growth. I'm seeing a lot more M&A starting to take place. And so really getting that system and process at scale is going to require the right tech stack.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, obviously, from a Lumient perspective. David, fantastic conversation today. One question I always finish on before we wrap up the podcast today, I ask all our guests is, if I'm an advisor out there on the fence, considering implementing a values-based or above the line, as you put it, experience for my clients and my business, what's one tip you would give me about doing that?
Well, I think the tip would be, talk to people like yourself, myself, the Lumient team, other business coaches that can help you to adopt that above the line approach. But my tip would be, give it a go. Don't think about it. Give it a go. When I first learnt about goals-based advice in 95, I gave it a go, and I had a tool to be able to show my clients, and it worked. When I learned about values-based advice, I gave it a go. And so give it a go. Don't be nervous. Don't be anxious. You're genuinely trying to help your clients. And I'm sure that, perhaps some people will reflect on this conversation in 5 years' time or 25 years' time and say, thank you, Mark, for having this podcast.
Yeah, no, I hope so too, David. We've covered so much today, and thank you for your time. Discussing things like go out and search for global best practice, talking about above the line solutions, not just below the line financial solutions. Asking things like what's important about money to you and holding that space, getting the right structure and processes and supporting tech so that you can play your trump card, which is discussing the values around money. David, this knowledge and best practice is invaluable, I'm sure, for our audience. And I just want to say thank you for your time.
Well, good on you, Mark. Nice to see you. And I hope the listeners get some great takeaways. More importantly, I hope they do something with the takeaways.
Agree. Thanks, David.
All right, Mark. Thanks, mate. Bye.